Hi and welcome to a new video, part of this series where we're exploring how to build an API with Django and the Django Rest Framework. To follow along, all you need to do is just clone the DRF API repository. The link is in the description of this video. Once you have this, we can get started. So far in this series, we've covered serializers, we've covered permissions, and now what we're going to take a look at are the views that we get access to in the Django Rest Framework package. Now here you can see we're using the APIView, which is a wrapper provided by the Django Rest Framework, and it's basically the simplest wrapper that we can use to create an API endpoint. We simply just specify the method we want to handle, such as GET requests or POST requests, and then the logic that takes place when we receive a request for that specific method. However, there are a lot of other views that we're not seeing and not using yet, so that's what we're going to explore now, are these different views that we have access to. Now, as we explore these views more, you'll see that they get more and more abstracted, and the benefit of this is that it allows us to write a lot less code while achieving the same goal. And we do this using class-based views, purely because it allows us to include little bits that contain certain logic that is what we want to include in one specific API endpoint. And it'll make more sense as we get into it. So what we can do is just come here and say from REST framework, import generics, and we're going to make use of the generic API view. So what we can do is actually just comment this view out. And we'll just come here, we'll call this our PostView, and it's going to inherit from generics.generic API view. And what we can do is actually just hover over this, and if we just press Command or probably Control on your Windows keyboard, you can go and check the code for this. And this is what we're inheriting from, and you can see that it's actually itself inheriting from the API view, which is what we were just using now. And all of these properties and methods that we see here on this class, these are all methods and properties that you're going to most likely need to know or have to override at some point, or at least it will be of great benefit for you. And we're not going to go into all of them right now, but it's a good practice to just come and see the code behind these views sometimes, just to really get a glimpse of something that you're actually using, because sometimes we just import things and we don't know what's actually going on behind the scenes. We don't know why we can override methods on a class, and it's good practice to just come and do this once in a while. And this isn't too big of a class to go and inspect and just learn about. It's a fairly simple one, and we're going to make use of this. So let's see how this works. We're making use of it here for our post view. And what we're going to do is define some properties that are required to make this work. The first one is going to be the serializer class. Now the serializer class is just the serializer, for example the post serializer, that we would use to serialize our data, whether that's a query set or an individual model. So what we do is just specify it. We specify the post serializer, in this case as the serializer class we want to use. And then we need to give it a query set to work with as well. And the query set is simply just a normal Django query set of some model. So we could say, for example, post.objects.all. And if we just take a look back here at the documentation of this view, the generic API view here, it's got query set equal to none, and it gives a little bit of an explanation as to if you're not specifying query set, then you need to specify the get query set method, which will then evaluate the query set per request, whereas here if you're just specifying it as a property, then it says it's cached, so the results are cached for all subsequent requests. So those are the two ways that you can specify a query set. And then we have the serializer class, or you can specify get serializer class, which is a method down here. And this is useful in the case that you want to serialize it differently depending on certain conditions, such as maybe the method of the request. So if you want to serialize it in a certain way for a GET request versus a POST request, you might have two different serializers, and you could use this method to determine which serializer class to use based on that request method. That's just one example of where this is handy. But this is also just giving you some background as to why we're specifying these properties on here, because they're specified on here, and there's a little bit of explanation as to how to go about that. And with that, we basically have set up our PostView. So what I'm going to do is just take that into our URLs, and we'll just import it here and specify it there. And our server is running, so let's just open this up in the browser. And okay, so we're getting here detailed method get is not allowed, and it says the only allowed option is the options method, which is by default. But what we want to do is specify the methods that are allowed to be queried on this endpoint, as we haven't done that yet. So if you'll see here on the test view that we had previously, you see that we were specifying the get method, the post method to handle those specific request methods. And we have to do the same thing here on the generic API view, because again, if we take a look at this, you can see that it inherits from the API view. And the rest of these are just properties or methods that allow us to work with that view a little bit easier. And if you actually come down a little bit, you'll get a glimpse of some of the other API views that inherit off of the generic API view, which we'll take a look at in a second. But even those are specifying, for example, the post method for a create API view, the get method for a list API view. So you can see that the method we specify is quite important, as that's still required. So what I'm going to do is just copy that, paste this, and we'll just comment that out, or back in rather. And in this case, we don't actually need to specify all of this, because we would be defeating the purpose of why we specified these properties. So I'm actually just going to remove that and introduce the next concept of mixins. Now, mixins are not something new in the Django Rest Framework. They're in Django itself. Mixins are basically these containers of functionality that you can include in your classes to inherit off of, that provide some sort of functionality or serve some other sort of purpose and help you achieve whatever you're trying to achieve in this view. Now, we always include them at the beginning of our inheritance here in the class. So if we are making use of a mixin, it's always going to go before the view, and that's the same in normal Django. So for example, we have the login required mixin, and that would make sure that that user has to be logged in or authenticated in order to access that endpoint. That's a built-in mixin in Django. We're going to make use of some of the mixins from the Django Rest Framework that we would use on our API endpoints. And we can do this just by importing them from Rest Framework, and just say import mixins. And then these mixins we can inherit from over here. So if we just look at the options we have create model mixin, destroy model mixin, list, retrieve, and update. So basically the CRUD operations that we have available as mixins. And you could basically guess as to what this is going to do for you. It's going to provide you with some functionality, which are going to be methods that you can override that perform or give you the ability to perform some functionality. So for example, the list model mixin would allow you to list a query set. If we take a look at the create model mixin, then you'll see it says create a model instance. So these mixins just provide us with unique functionality to serve one particular purpose. So let's go and look at the list model mixin and inherit from that. And because we're now inheriting from this, we gain access to some properties. So let's also go and inspect that. So if you look at this list model mixin, it says we can list a query set, and it gives us one method, just one, which is list. It takes in all of the arguments that we would provide a normal API view, as we see over here, self request args, keyword args. So we're passing all of that into this method. Query set is being defined as the filtered query set of the method we specify as self.getQuerySet, which we looked at earlier. So it's getting the query set, it's then paginating it, it's then serializing it, and then returning a response of that data. And this should look pretty familiar to what we have here in, for example, just this view, because we've got a query set, we are serializing it, we're returning a response of the serializer data. That's exactly what this is doing. It's just being done for us, and with a little bit of extra functionality such as pagination and filtering. Now, this list method is what we're going to use here, and we'll just make sure we comment that again, here in our get method, because if we were to go and specify all of this functionality again, we'd just be repeating ourselves and not really making use of the methods we have access to. So we could basically just say return self.list and pass in all the arguments, and it would go and do all of this, and at the end return a response of that serializer data. And it's just important to see that that's actually what it's doing behind the scenes, because if we just said return list, or rather self.list of these arguments, this wouldn't make any sense. So it's just important to go and see why are we doing that. We can go and take a look at the code behind this, which is a method that we're inheriting from thanks to the list model mixin. And the code we ultimately land up writing is very short and sweet. We're only defining the things that are really important, such as the serializer and the query set that we want to work with. So like this, let's come back here, refresh this. And now you can see we have allowed methods, the first one being a get request, because now we're specifying the get method here. And the only reason we have an empty query set is because we don't have any data. So what we want to do is just create some data now so that we can see this coming through. And what I'm going to do is inherit from another mixin just to demonstrate some more functionality. So let's go and inherit from mixins.create model mixin. And let's go take a look at that one. And here you can see we have two more methods. So we have create, which is then getting the serializer, checking if it's valid, raising an exception if it's not valid. And then it calls self.performCreate, which is a very nice and short method. And all it does is just take in a serializer and save the serializer. So basically just saving the serializer and creating a model based off of the data that we're passing into the serializer. And then we're just getting the headers and passing that as headers in the response. And again, it's serializing or passing in the serializer data. And then the status is the HTTP 201 status, which means that something was created. These two methods are very important to understand. The get success headers is just what's being called over here. So headers equals self.getSuccessHeaders, which is just doing a check to find the location, which is something that's part of the API settings and a little bit more advanced, but it's not something that we're particularly interested in terms of the functionality that we gain access to. Right now, we're only concerned with creating an instance, and these two methods help us do that. So what you can do when inheriting from the create model mixin is either you can override the perform create method. So we could say define perform create, and we know that we can do this because we're inheriting from this create model mixin, which has that method there. And maybe there's something that you want to do right before you save it, or maybe you want to pass some data into the save method when it is being saved. So all we need to do here is just pass in self and the serializer, and we could say, for example, let's say send an email, and then we could just say serializer.save. And that's exactly what this method does. It's just now you're overriding it and putting in some sort of custom logic that you want to in between the serializer being saved and the method being called. And we could also go and just define the create method and basically just override this method, but that wouldn't help us in terms of handling a request method. So for example, the get or post method, what we'd rather want to do is override the post method and then call our create method here that we're inheriting now as what to do when we get a post request. So this is going to take all of the same arguments, and then we could just say return self.create and pass in all of those same arguments. And we can actually get rid of self there. We don't need to pass that in. So just like that, and get rid of it there. Cool. So again, what's happening here, we're inheriting from these mixins, which are giving us specific methods that we can use as kind of shortcut methods. And we can use that to just make our lives a little bit easier and write a lot less code when we want to handle a specific method. So let's go back here and refresh this. And now you can see, because we have included the post method as an accepted method, that means that the Django Rest Framework UI will allow us to fill in this form, and we can then post and it will create an instance for us. So let's say this is the first post, and this is a description, and the owner is just going to be admin. Hit post, and now you can see that we're getting some data back, and that's from that GET request. So we can actually call it again, and actually the last response was the HTTP 201, which is why it was only returning us a dictionary, because that's the serializer data being returned back to us after we create something. But now, because we've hit the GET button, now we're being returned a list of instances, and that's the response we get back from a GET request. So hopefully this all makes sense so far in terms of Mixins and the generic API view, and how we've gone from the base API view and really looked at the path of inheritance to the generic API view, adding a little bit more functionality in a really easy way thanks to these Mixins. And from this, we can then go one step further, and that's making use of the list API view and a whole bunch of other API views that extend even further from the generic API view. So let's go back here to this, and if we just scroll down and we go all the way down to the bottom, then you can see we touched on this earlier, the create API view, and this is pretty much doing exactly what we are doing over here, because we've specified the post method, which is calling self.create thanks to the Mixin we're inheriting from. And that's exactly what's being done over here. The post method is being handled, and it's just calling self.create because it itself is inheriting from the create model Mixin. So in essence, what we could do is we could just create another one here, call this class post create view, and this is going to inherit from generics.create API view. And on here we have to specify again these properties which are required, so serializer class and query set, and that's it. We don't need to specify any methods because we're inheriting from this create API view, and that is inheriting from the generic API view, which at the top needs to have the query set and the serializer class specified. So you can see this path of code being written going less and less, because we started off with the API view, and we can actually just bring this all the way to the top and just use it as an example to see how this code is getting less and less. So we started with this test view. We have the get method and the post method. We're writing quite a lot of code for each one. Then we abstract that further into Mixins, and now we're abstracting that into a generic API view that has all the functionality we need for a post method endpoint. And so there's only one difference between this method and this, or rather this class and this class right now, and that's the fact that this one doesn't handle the get method right now. It only handles the post method. Now you could add the get method in two ways. One, we could just go and specify the list model Mixin, and we can do that. We can still inherit from other model Mixins. So we just do that, and we could just copy the get method and paste it there. So maybe we want to have a create view and have a very little customized get method that handles a special way that we will list our instances, or however we want to do it. But the point is we can still mix and match these Mixins with our generic API views. And for example, let's just take this and we can go into the URLs, we'll import it here, and let's just put this as create, which will use the post create view, and just give it a name, and that's all good. So if we come back here and go to /create, then you can see that we have the get method being allowed for us to click this button over here, and we still have the form. So everything's exactly the same, and the code is just a little bit less. But even still, this is something that we can go even further to abstract, and we can use another generic API view. If we just scroll down and go past all of these, then you'll see you have the list create API view, and that's inheriting from the list model mixin, inheriting from the create model mixin, and basically doing what we were doing here, except we were using one mixin and the create API view, whereas this one is just using both mixins and specifying both of the methods on here, get and post. So what we can do is we can just inherit from the list create API view, and we'll just call this one post list create view. It's going to inherit from the list create API view, and all we need to do is specify the serializer class and the query set. And now we have the exact same functionality as this one before it, which is the exact same functionality as this one before it. So hopefully this is now becoming clear as to how little code we are writing to achieve the exact same thing in this journey of abstraction. And just to prove the point, we can take this into the URLs, bring this here, and let's call this one the list create, which will take in this. So let's take this URL, come here, and let's just see. We're not importing that, so let's just come over here, and this is meant to be generics dot list create API view. There we go. And just refresh this, and there you go, exact same thing. So this is just an introduction to the views that we have access to in the Django Rest Framework package. The bottom line of this video is basically just look at what you're inheriting from. So how we were going through here in the actual source code, just going and take a look at what views do we have access to, what can we inherit from that makes it easier to achieve whatever we want to achieve. And we haven't gone through retrieve API or retrieve update API view and a whole bunch of these other ones, because there are still some other ones here, but it's the exact same concept as before. Just now this one, for example, is inheriting or allowing you to specify the put method and the delete method, and it's calling self.update, self.destroy. The same kind of syntax or design that we're seeing is applied, and you can go back and see what is self.destroy, and that comes from the destroy model mixin. So if you go to the destroy model mixin, then you can take a look at the actual mixin itself, and that gives you the destroy method, which gets the instance with self.getObject. It calls self.perform destroy, so the same as what we saw with perform create, and all that does is just call instance.delete, and then returns the response of the HTTP 204 status. It's very straightforward to follow to see where this code comes from, and it's not a lot of code to really go through. You can see these files are very short. It's 80 lines of code in this one. This one is more or less 300. It's not a lot that you really have to go through, and it's a lot of functionality that you're getting access to. So that's the bottom line of this video. And then just a heads up that this is the last video of this series where we explain concepts of the Django Rest Framework. So look out for the next few series where we'll actually be building applications and using what we've learned in this series to help us on that. So we'll include the links to those series in the description of this video. And until then, if you found it helpful, leave a comment down below, let us know what you thought. And otherwise, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.